and thank you for joining us on Ask a Historian. I'm Matthew Wilkinson, historian with Heritage Mississauga, and each week we invite you to send in your questions and we will explore the history of the city of Mississauga together. Are there things that you're curious about? Perhaps events from our past, street names, park names, or buildings on our landscape? We look forward to exploring the fascinating story of Mississauga with you. This week's episode continues from last week's, which was a story of shipwrecks and those wrecks associated with Port Credit. It is a fascinating chapter of our story when we look back at the life and times of those who plied the waters of Lake Ontario generations ago. Last week, we looked at several historic shipwrecks that had ties to Port Credit, including that of the Minnie Blakely, the Pinta, and the Jessie Drummond. An earlier episode of Ask a Historian looked at the sinking of the Augusta. As a maritime community, many residents of Port Credit and the surrounding area, Lakeview and Clarkson and elsewhere, their lives were tied to life on the water, and tragically the waters of Lake Ontario have claimed many lives and vessels over time. Many ships that historically plied the waters of the lake were schooners, and many of which were locally built, including shipyards at Port Credit, Oakville, and Bronte, and elsewhere. There are many stories of stonehookers lost in storms, and the sailors who never returned home, their final resting place being under the cold, deep waters of Lake Ontario. Schooner Days by C.H.J. Schneider, which is a fantastic book looking at the era of the stonehookers and the schooners that plied the waters, along with several other articles and excerpts by the late Port Credit historian Lorne Joyce, recall the heyday of the stonehooking trade and that fleet of stonehookers that was centered on Port Credit. Many of the families who are connected to the stonehookers of Port Credit and the schooners that plied the water still have descendants in Mississauga, including the Block, Blower, Hare, Harrison, Lind, Miller, Nash, Peer, and Shaw families, to name just a few. Many records are challenging to find. There are scatterings of newspaper clippings about some of the wrecks, written references to others, while some are remembered only by the name of the vessel, while others are lost only to time. The stonehooker Defiance was built in 1848 near the mouth of the Etobicoke Creek by the boat builder Boss Harris of Port Credit, and was so named in defiance of claims of riparian rights by surrounding farmers, something that Harris ignored when building the schooner. She was owned by Charles McCraney and R. Kirk, and her crew generally came from Port Credit and Lakeview. She left harbor on September 5th of 1913 with a full load of stone. Bucking winds, with waves too rough to enter the western gap at Toronto Harbor, she rounded Toronto Island to try for the eastern channel. But the pounding of the lake began to take their toll on the old stonehooker, and she sprang a leak as she rounded Toronto Island. The crew had the pumps going, but it was a losing fight. As they rounded the island, the rudder jammed, and the Defiance was running as fast as the seas would push her, without steering. She drifted towards the Scarborough Bluffs, where she finally beached at the base of the cliffs. With much difficulty in the pounding surf, the crew was able to get ashore in a yawl, leaving the old Defiance to her fate, where she broke apart into 1,000 pieces, as it was recorded, mere minutes later. And again, that was on September 5th of 1913, the wreck of the Defiance that had plied the waters of Lake Ontario for over 60 years. Our next story this week is on the Samson. The Samson was a schooner of scow design famous in Port Credit. She was 42 tons and built by Captain Miller in Port Credit in 1850, and she was owned by local sailor Caleb Giles. The Samson traversed the waters between Port Credit and Scarborough for a time and was seen kind of as the flagship of Port Credit. In fact, the fleet was roughly known, the fleet of stonehookers out of Port Credit was roughly referred to by mariners as the Samson Fleet, to distinguish them from the vessels that sailed out of the eastern ports, such as Whitby and Oshawa, which were referred to as the Highland Fleet or the Highland Rangers. The Samson could carry the largest load of all the Port Credit-based stonehookers, a full 80 tons of stone when she was fully laden. She was a fore and aft schooner with 7 sails, the largest of the fleet. She was returning to her home port at Port Credit on the night of November 25th, 1873, and caught in a gale with blinding snow, high seas, and freezing temperatures. The same storm that claimed another schooner, the Anna Belchambers. The spray from the waves coated everything in ice, and she became top-heavy. She reportedly passed the floundering Anna Belchambers near Toronto Island, but could either do nothing in the waves or simply did not see her. Helmed by skipper Billy Hutchinson of Port Credit and his deckhand named Crosby, the Samson rounded the point and made a dash for home. She never made it. It is believed that she was swamped somewhere off of Lakeview, possibly near the mouth of Surson's Creek. The bodies of Hutchinson and Crosby were later found near Surson's Creek, on the shore, encased in ice. The wreck of the Samson washed up near the mouth of the Humber River. And it was a story that was lamented in Port Credit for many years to come, particularly because William Hutchinson, Billy, was a beloved local mariner, was a young man of only 30 years of age, and he left behind a wife and a young child. Our next story this week is on the Maggie Hunter. And the Maggie Hunter may be one of the more famous wreck stories to come out of Lake Ontario from the latter half of the 19th century. The Maggie Hunter was not an overly large schooner, but she was larger than all the other stonehookers that plied out of Port Credit. In fact, she was not a stonehooker, she was a cargo vessel. And her home port for a time was Port Credit, but she was also based out of Oakville and later, towards the end of her life, from Kingston. She was larger than the other ships in Port Credit at the time. She was a contemporary rival of the Minnie Blakely. And the Maggie Hunter was a schooner built and could carry 300 tons of cargo when fully laden. She was built in Oakville in 1875, and at the time of our story, October of 1876, she was just over a year old. She was a new vessel for plying the waters of Lake Ontario. The Maggie Hunter, although at the time of our story she was actually renamed officially the Helen, although the name never caught on, she was still referred to as the Maggie Hunter. She was bringing in 300 tons of coal loaded in Oswego, and she was bound for Kingston. Her captain, a much beloved mariner, was a wild, hard-swearing man named Frank Nixon of Toronto. He was a respected veteran of the lakes, having sailed for more than 30 years, and it was said that his language frightened the young ladies and challenged the Methodists, who forbade the use of colorful words. So you can just picture this salty mariner with some colorful language walking the shores where his boat might have been docked. On the eve of the fateful trip, the two rivals, the Maggie Hunter and the Minnie Blakely, laid side by side in Oswego. George Sharp of Port Credit was the first mate on the Hunter, and his brother Dan, who later served as the harbor master in Port Credit, was the captain of the Blakely. It was October 10th, 1876. "I'm not going out this day," said Dan, who said Dan to his brother George. The weather was turning and a nor'wester was beginning to blow. "We are," said George, "but it's not my choice, I tell you. The old man says neither hell nor Helen are enough to hold him back." That was, Frank Nixon was determined to go. George Sharp, the mate on the Hunter, had married Mary Nash of Port Credit, and they had a little house down on the lakefront on the east side of the harbor. They also had a young son. His name was Jimmy. He was 2 years old, and another baby was on the way. That night, in the midst of a vicious storm, Mrs. Sharp had a fearful dream that her husband was in peril, and the next morning she was frantic for news. The news never came. Captain Dan Sharp of the Blakely returned to Port Credit a week later. The Minnie Blakely had made a good run to Toronto, and he had come home to Port Credit by train. Captain Dan believed that his brother George was likely safely in Kingston long ahead of him, because the Hunter had left Oswego 2 mornings before the Blakely, and when they had left, he observed from a distance that all appeared to be well. But the Maggie Hunter never made it to port. Long they looked for her, but nothing really was ever found of her or her crew, except for a broken jib boom that was picked up a year later. Also later, about a year to a year and a half later, bits of wreckage were found near Oswego, a window frame, a spar, and a trunk, and later, a body. Those lost with the Maggie Hunter were Captain Frank Nixon, who left a wife and 6 children in Toronto; George Sharp, the mate from Port Credit, who left a wife and 2 young children; One of the sailors was a young man named Walter Post of Ferry Point near Belleville. The other sailors were brothers Thomas and William Martin of Belleville and John Newman, who was either from Port Credit or Belleville. The reports were contradictory at the time. They each left a wife and children behind. There was also a passenger on board, but his identity was not clearly known, though he may have been one Willard Laurel. The only body recovered was that of the cook, Anne Wallace. The story of the wreck of the Maggie Hunter remained part of the mariner's legend for generations. The Hunter's final resting place has never been found. In 1934, her story was recorded in song as a folk song by C.H.J. Schneider. There were other vessels that met a similar fate. Vessels like the Caledonia, which was built in Port Credit in 1842 and plied the lake until the spring of 1880, when a sudden snow squall near Oshawa blinded the ship's progress, and she ran aground near Bluff Point. And in the next few hours, a storm whipped the lake into a fury and tore apart the little vessel. The crew managed to escape, but faced a long, cold, lonely night stranded on the beach before help arrived. Another ship, the schooner Highland Chief, was built a year before that in Port Credit in 1841 and wrecked in a treacherous storm on September 27, 1873, trying to find shelter in Toronto Harbour through the Eastern Channel. The Chief, as she was called, was owned by Alexander Ure of Port Credit and was sailed by Captain John Cuthbert. At the time, she was loaded with stone, and she went down quickly after striking the submerged boiler of an earlier wreck. The crew of three of the Chief were able to save themselves by jumping into a scow they were towing, and the Highland Chief broke apart in the storm. Another schooner was the Sunshine, a full-ended scow, schooner rigged, owned by Captain Aaron Walker of Port Credit. She was swept out of the Credit Harbour in the flood of 1878 and dashed against the pier. She damaged, to drift out into the lake, unmanned, and was caught in the pounding surf and broke apart. Still another was the Coronet, designed and built in Port Credit by Captain John Miller, and later sold to Captain Elijah Pickett. She was one of the largest and fastest stonehookers in the fleet. The Coronet sprang a leak and quickly went down on June 23, 1899, just after clearing Port Credit Harbour and was within sight of the St. Lawrence Starch Company. And there were more. But thank you for joining us for another episode of Ask a Historian. We look forward to continue to explore and share the fascinating stories of the history of the city of Mississauga with you. Thank you.